The wind stirred the dry leaves across the empty street, their rustling the only sound in the stillness of the night. The small town of Oakwood was silent, save for the occasional creak of a sign swaying in the breeze. The houses, each one neatly manicured, sat like quiet sentinels under the dim glow of the streetlights, their windows dark, unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. Ava stood at the edge of the sidewalk, her breath visible in the cool night air, her hands tucked deep into the pockets of her jacket. The 20-year-old woman felt like a stranger in her own town, though she had once walked these streets as a girl, full of dreams and uncertain hope. Back then, everything had been different. She had been different. She remembered the feeling of the ground beneath her feet, the laughter of her friends, the bright future that seemed just within her grasp. But that future had been ripped away when she was just 13 years old. The memory of being thrown out of her childhood home, of being abandoned by the very people who were supposed to protect her, was still fresh in her mind. She had been young, pregnant, and alone, cast aside by those who didn't understand or care to. The whispers, the stares, the rejection, it all stung. But tonight, as Ava stood on that same sidewalk, there was no trace of the broken girl who had once wandered the streets searching for refuge. She had survived, she had rebuilt herself, and now she was back. There was no question in her mind. She was here to make them see her, to make them listen. The town, the school, the people who had judged her and forced her to disappear. They would have to confront the woman she had become. As she glanced up at the school, a looming structure at the end of the road, memories of the cruel rejection she faced there flooded her mind. But this time, she wasn't afraid. The storm inside her had been brewing for years, and tonight it was about to break. The wind stirred the dry leaves across the empty street, their rustling the only sound in the stillness of the night. The small town of Oakwood was silent, save for the occasional creak of a sign swaying in the breeze. The houses, each one neatly manicured, sat like quiet sentinels under the dim glow of the streetlights, their windows dark, unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. Ava stood at the edge of the sidewalk, her breath visible in the cool night air, her hands tucked deep into the pockets of her jacket. The 20-year-old woman felt like a stranger in her own town, though she had once walked these streets as a girl, full of dreams and uncertain hope. Back then, everything had been different. She had been different. She remembered the feeling of the ground beneath her feet, the laughter of her friends, the bright future that seemed just within her grasp. But that future had been ripped away when she was just 13 years old. The memory of being thrown out of her childhood home, of being abandoned by the very people who were supposed to protect her, was still fresh in her mind. She had been young, pregnant, and alone, cast aside by those who didn't understand or care to. The whispers, the stares, the rejection, it all stung. But tonight, as Ava stood on that same sidewalk, there was no trace of the broken girl who had once wandered the streets searching for refuge. She had survived, she had rebuilt herself, and now she was back. There was no question in her mind. She was here to make them see her, to make them listen. The town, the school, the people who had judged her and forced her to disappear, they would have to confront the woman she had become. As she glanced up at the school, a looming structure at the end of the road, memories of the cruel rejection she faced there flooded her mind. But this time, she wasn't afraid. The storm inside her had been brewing for years, and tonight it was about to break. Ava took a deep breath, the weight of the years pressing against her chest. Her footsteps were steady as she moved toward the entrance of the high school, the place where it had all started, the place that had turned its back on her. The doors stood tall before her, the same metal doors she had once walked through, nervous but full of youthful anticipation. Back then, she hadn't known the cruelty that awaited her, the judgment that would define her for years. Her fingers grazed the cold handle, and for a moment she hesitated, but only for a moment. The girl who had once trembled in the face of rejection had been replaced by a woman who had learned how to stand strong, even when the world told her she didn't belong. As the doors swung open, she was met with the hum of the school's fluorescent lights and the dull murmur of students talking in the hallways. It was almost surreal. This place that had once felt like a prison, a place where she was mocked, labeled, and abandoned, now felt oddly distant. The echoes of the past still lingered in the air, but Ava wasn't here to relive her past. She was here to reshape the future. The sound of lockers slamming shut and laughter echoed through the halls as she made her way through the corridors. Some students glanced at her curiously, while others quickly turned away, pretending not to notice the stranger walking among them. Her eyes scanned the faces, some familiar, some not. The faces of the people who had been there when it all fell apart, when the school had decided that she was too much of a distraction to be allowed to continue her education. When they had looked at her, 13 years old and pregnant, and decided that she was nothing but a problem to be swept under the rug. They had forced her out, and in doing so, they had shattered her confidence, leaving her to navigate a world that seemed determined to remind her of her failure. She felt the familiar sting of shame, but it was quickly replaced by a surge of anger. She had worked too hard, endured too much, to let this place, these people, remind her of what they had taken from her. Ava turned the corner, her eyes immediately falling on the principal's office at the end of the hall. There was no turning back now. She had come to confront the man who had made the decision to expel her, to condemn her to a life that had been filled with struggle and survival. As she reached for the door to the office, a voice stopped her in her tracks. "Ava?" She turned to find Emily, a girl she had once called a friend, standing behind her. Her face was soft with confusion, the years having softened the sharp edges of the teenage girl who had once whispered behind Ava's back. Emily had been one of the few people who had known about Ava's pregnancy back then, before the rumors spread like wildfire, before the school made it clear that Ava no longer had a place in their world. But despite their past, despite the bond they once shared, Ava knew Emily had never been on her side. "What are you doing here?" Emily asked, her voice tentative, as if she wasn't quite sure how to approach the woman Ava had become. Her eyes flickered nervously toward the principal's office, a flicker of recognition passing through her. Ava stood tall, her expression unreadable. "I'm here to finish what you all started," she replied quietly, her voice steady but charged with an energy that made Emily take an instinctive step back. "Ava, you need to leave," Emily said, her tone taking on a pleading edge. "You don't understand. Things have changed. You're not the same person. None of us are. It was hard, but you can't just come back and expect things to be like they were." Ava's lips parted as she took in the words, but they didn't sting like they used to. "You don't get it, Emily," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'm not trying to make things like they were. I'm here to make them see the truth." Emily opened her mouth as if to protest, but Ava continued. "You all thought you could just sweep me away, thought that by kicking me out, by labeling me a mistake, you'd be rid of me. But you were wrong. I'm not a mistake. I'm a woman who fought for everything she has, and I'm here to make sure you understand what that means." Emily's face softened, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of the girl Ava had once known. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the uneasy tension that had defined their relationship over the years. "I never wanted any of this to happen to you," Emily whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "But you don't have to do this. You're better than this. You've moved on." Ava shook her head slowly, her eyes never leaving Emily's face. "No, Emily, I'm not better than this. But I'm better than what you and everyone else thought I was." She turned and pushed the door to the principal's office open, her eyes locking on to the familiar figure behind the desk. Principal Carter, now in his late 40s, looked up from his paperwork as the door opened. His eyes widened in recognition, and for the first time in years, Ava saw a flicker of something in his eyes. A flash of unease, of guilt, of something he hadn't expected to face. "Ava," he said, his voice tight, his face hardening almost immediately. "This isn't the place for you. I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to leave. Now." But Ava stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not leaving until you hear me out," she said, her voice sharp, cutting through the tension in the room. Principal Carter's expression hardened. "You don't belong here anymore," he said, his voice now cold, dismissive. "What do you want from me?" Ava took a step closer, her fists clenched at her sides. I want you to admit what you did to me, to the girl I was, to the girl you told was nothing. The words came out before she could stop them, her voice thick with emotion, with the years of pain and betrayal. I want you to own what you did. You destroyed my life, and I'm here to make sure you never forget it. For the first time since she had entered term, for the first time since she had entered the room, Principal Carter faltered. His lips pressed together in a thin line, and his gaze dropped to the papers on his desk, unable to meet her eyes. The silence that stretched between them was heavy, thick with the weight of everything left unsaid. Ava stood there breathing deeply, her heart pounding. She wasn't leaving, not until they all understood. The silence in the room hung thick, punctuated only by the steady hum of fluorescent lights above them. Principal Carter shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting between Ava and the door, as if searching for an escape. His fingers twitched on the desk, betraying the calm exterior he was trying so desperately to maintain. Ava stood unmoving, her body rigid with the tension that pulsed through her veins. She could feel the weight of his gaze, but she refused to flinch. This was her moment, the culmination of years of pain, of fighting, of learning to survive. She wasn't the scared girl she had been when they'd thrown her away. She was a woman now, and she would make them listen. Carter's attempts to ignore her, to dismiss her as though she didn't matter, only fueled her resolve. His eyes flickered with something she couldn't quite place. Guilt, maybe, or perhaps fear. But he quickly masked it, settling into his usual authoritarian posture. "You need to leave," he said again, his voice cold and clipped, a thin layer of command beneath the words. "I'm not going to repeat myself. This isn't your place anymore, Ava. You don't belong here." His gaze hardened, but there was a tremor there that didn't go unnoticed. Ava's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere until you hear me, until you admit what you did, until you understand how you destroyed everything I was." Carter's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't used to being challenged. It was easier to dismiss people like her, people who had been problems to be dealt with, erased from memory. His authority had always been absolute in this town, his decisions final, unquestioned. But today it felt different. Ava wasn't a child anymore, wasn't a victim. She was standing here confronting him, and he couldn't control the situation the way he once had. "You don't understand," he muttered almost to himself. "You think you're the only one who's had it hard? You think you're the only one who's suffered?" His voice rose with frustration, but Ava wasn't intimidated. She had heard it all before. The hollow excuses, the blame shifting, the self-righteous anger. People like him always made themselves the victims, pretending they were just following orders, doing what was right. She could see through it, and it sickened her. "You made the choice to throw me away," she shot back, her voice sharp. "You were the one who decided my future was over before it even started. You didn't care about me, you cared about yourself, about keeping your perfect little school intact, about keeping up appearances." That's the truth, Carter. His eyes flashed with something, anger perhaps, or recognition, and for a brief moment, he seemed to lose control. His hands slammed down on the desk, the sound reverberating through the room like a gunshot. "Enough," he barked, his face reddening. "You need to stop this right now. You don't know what you're talking about. You have no idea what it's like to make these kinds of decisions, to be responsible for the school, for the parents who—" "I don't need your excuses anymore," Ava interrupted, her voice steady but laced with an edge. "I'm not a child anymore. I'm a woman who has fought tooth and nail to survive. I'm done with people like you trying to put me in a box, to tell me I don't matter." His face twisted with disbelief. "You don't get to come back here, making accusations, throwing all this in my face after all this time. You left. You chose to leave, remember." "I didn't choose this," Ava spat, her hands trembling with a mix of rage and resolve. "You made that choice for me. You decided I wasn't worth your time. You kicked me out, like I was some burden to be rid of. You didn't even give me a chance. And then you sent me out into the world, like I was just another mistake to be swept under the rug. Well, I'm done being swept under the rug, Carter. I'm done being invisible." The words hung in the air, sharp and bitter, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like it might choke them both. Carter opened his mouth as though to respond, but Ava didn't let him. She was past that now, past waiting for him to give her permission to exist in his world. She had long since stopped caring about what people like him thought of her. She had lived through their rejection, and she had come out stronger on the other side, and now she was going to make them acknowledge her. The door to the office opened suddenly, and Mr. Hatcher stepped inside, his face tight with uncertainty. He had always been kind to her, back when she was just a scared girl trying to hold her life together. But now, as his eyes landed on her, Ava saw the hesitance, the caution, the way he looked at her as though she might break if he said the wrong thing. The disappointment flickered in his eyes too, and she could feel it like a weight pressing down on her chest. "Ava," Mr. Hatcher said softly, taking a step toward her, "maybe we can talk about this outside. There's no need to escalate things like this." His voice was filled with the kind of false concern that Ava had grown to recognize, the kind that masked the discomfort of being in a position where someone was challenging the status quo. "No," she said, her tone firm, cutting through the air. "I'm not going anywhere until he hears me, until they all hear me." She glanced over at Carter, whose face was now pale, his posture stiff with a mixture of anger and fear. "This isn't your fight," Carter muttered, trying to regain control. But Ava could see through the cracks in his facade. He wasn't as confident as he wanted her to believe. "You're wasting your time. I've made my decision, and I'm not going to change it. Now leave." But Ava didn't move. Instead, she crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "You're wrong. I'm not wasting my time. I'm making sure that what you did to me doesn't get buried anymore. I'm making sure that everyone knows exactly who you are." The words hit him like a slap, and for a moment he was silent. The tension in the room grew unbearable, the weight of the unspoken truce hanging in the air, like a storm about to break. Carter's hand gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white as he fought to keep his composure. Ava could feel the power shift, could see the cracks in his control. She wasn't the same girl he had thrown out of this office years ago. She was different now, stronger. And this time, she wasn't going to let them erase her. Not again. Ava's words lingered in the air, a charged silence settling between her and Carter. The weight of the moment seemed to suspend everything, the tension thick enough to suffocate. Her eyes never left his, daring him to respond, daring him to deny her truth one more time. She could see the struggle in his face, the inner conflict between maintaining his authority and confronting the mess he had helped create. His breathing quickened, the flush on his cheeks deepening as the realization of what she was doing started to settle in. She wasn't just challenging his authority, she was shattering the version of reality he had so carefully built, exposing him for the hypocrite he was. Then, without warning, Carter slammed his palm down on the desk, the sharp crack of the impact snapping Ava back to reality. She had expected him to react, but not with such fury. The air in the room seemed to shift, crackling with hostility as he stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You think you can just waltz back in here after everything? After all the damage you caused?" His voice was low, dangerous, but Ava stood her ground, every fiber of her being screaming at her to keep going, to push him further, to make him face the consequences of his actions. "I didn't cause any damage, Carter," Ava shot back, her voice firm, but trembling with a rage she hadn't allowed herself to feel until now. "You did. You ruined my life, and you think I should just forgive you because you don't want to be reminded of it? I don't think so. You don't get to walk away from what you did." The words hung between them like a punch waiting to land. The raw emotion in Ava's voice made Carter flinch, but he quickly masked it with anger. His eyes were now wide with something that bordered on panic. The room was charged with the kind of tension that could snap at any moment. Ava could feel it building, could sense the violence simmering beneath the surface of Carter's controlled exterior. "Get out," Carter hissed, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "You don't belong here, Ava. You never did. You're just here to cause trouble, to stir things up. I've been patient enough, but I won't stand for this anymore. Get out before I have you removed." Ava's heart pounded in her chest, but there was no fear in her anymore. Only resolve. She had spent too many years being told she didn't matter, that her voice wasn't important, but she was done being silenced. She was done being small. The realization hit her like a jolt of electricity. This was it. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, the moment she took back the power she'd lost all those years ago. No, she said, the word a quiet promise that carried more weight than any scream. I'm not going anywhere until you admit what you've done, until you tell everyone what you did to me. The room fell into an eerie stillness, each of them holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. Carter's face twisted in anger, his eyes narrowing as he stepped toward her, towering over her with his broad shoulders and his flushed face. She could feel his rage radiating off him in waves, and yet she stood firm, her eyes locked onto his, refusing to back down. "Get out!" he shouted again, louder this time, his voice cracking with frustration. "You're a mistake, Ava. You always have been. Now leave before I have security throw you out." For a moment, Ava felt a flicker of doubt, a brief hesitation. She had expected him to be angry, but not like this. There was something raw, something desperate in his eyes, and for a split second, she almost wondered if it was guilt. Guilt over what he had done to her, guilt over how he had treated her. But that thought was quickly pushed aside. She couldn't afford to be distracted by his emotions. This wasn't about him. It was about her. "I'm not a mistake," Ava said, her voice steady, but it carried an undercurrent of something dangerous. "And you can't just throw me away anymore. I'm not the girl you discarded, Carter. I'm a woman who knows her worth now, and I'm not leaving until you acknowledge that." Carter's face contorted with rage, his fist clenched at his side. Without another word, he moved toward her, as if he was going to grab her by the arm and force her out. But Ava didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. Instead, she took a step forward, closing the distance between them. The tension between them was palpable, like the calm before a storm. And then it happened. In one swift motion, Carter reached out, grabbing her by the wrist with more force than she expected. The suddenness of it shocked her, and for a split second her breath caught in her throat. But even as he tightened his grip, she didn't back down. She didn't flinch. She looked him dead in the eye, her eyes burning with fury and something else. Something unshakable. She wasn't the frightened girl anymore. She wasn't the girl who had let him push her out of her own life. "You have no right," Ava whispered through gritted teeth, struggling against his grip. "You have no right to touch me, to treat me like this. Not anymore." Carter's face twisted into a snarl, his grip tightening, but then something shifted. A crack appeared in the facade of control he had so carefully built. His eyes flickered with uncertainty, and for just a moment he hesitated. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Ava seized the moment, her voice growing stronger, more powerful. "Let go of me," she demanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. And for the first time, Carter hesitated. He released his grip on her wrist, taking a step back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was frozen, the stillness deafening. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Ava could hear the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, the adrenaline still rushing through her veins. The consequences of this moment were immediate, but neither of them could see how deeply it would ripple out from here. Carter stood in front of her, his chest rising and falling with each breath, his eyes flickering with something he didn't want to admit. And Ava stood there, just as still, her pulse steady now, as she looked at him, unwavering. She had taken back what had always been hers, her voice, her power, her dignity. No one was going to take that from her again. "You've lost," she said quietly, but with certainty. "You're done pretending you're in control. I'm not the girl you kicked out anymore. I'm here to make sure the world knows what you did, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." A long beat passed. Carter didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth had been spoken, and in the silence that followed, Ava knew that nothing could ever be the same again. The balance had shifted. This was no longer a battle for control. This was the beginning of something new, something that could never be undone. Ava stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, her chest rising and falling with the weight of the moment. The room, once filled with tension, now felt like an empty shell, echoing the silence that hung in the air. Her wrist, where Carter had grabbed her, still throbbed, but it was nothing compared to the rush of adrenaline that flooded her system. She had done it. She had faced him down and taken back what he had tried to strip from her all those years ago. And yet, as the gravity of the situation settled over her, an unsettling feeling crept up her spine. This was just the beginning. She knew Carter wouldn't let this go easily. He wouldn't let her expose the truth without a fight. Her gaze shifted toward the door, her mind racing. She could hear the faint hum of voices from down the hall, people whispering, perhaps catching wind of the altercation that was unfolding in the principal's office. Ava's heartbeat began to pick up again, the reality of her decision settling in. She was here now, standing on the precipice of something that would change everything. Her gaze shifted toward the door, her mind racing. She could hear the faint hum of voices from down the hall, people whispering, perhaps catching wind of the altercation that was unfolding in the principal's office. Ava's heartbeat began to pick up again, the reality of her decision settling in. She was here now, standing on the precipice of something that would change everything. Her life, his, the whole community's. The truth was out there, and it couldn't be erased. There was no going back from this. Suddenly the door flew open, and two uniformed officers stormed in, their boots heavy against the floor as they quickly assessed the scene. Ava didn't flinch, even though the sight of them sent a fresh wave of unease through her. She had expected them. This was the response she had been bracing for, the inevitable backup that Carter had no doubt called. She could feel the heaviness of the officers' eyes on her, their silent assessment as they scanned the room, taking in the tension, the palpable animosity that lingered in the air. Carter was the first to speak, his voice shaky but filled with authority. "This woman has no right to be here," he said, his finger pointing at Ava with a swift motion. "She's causing a scene, disrupting the school. I need her removed immediately." One of the officers, a tall man with a stern face and a badge that gleamed under the fluorescent lights, glanced between Carter and Ava. His eyes softened for just a moment when they landed on her, but it was quick, almost imperceptible. The other officer, a younger woman with a cold expression, kept her gaze fixed firmly on Ava, as if she was already deciding how to handle her. "What's going on here?" the man asked, his voice firm but not unkind. Ava didn't wait for Carter to answer. She wasn't going to let him twist the narrative anymore. She couldn't afford to back down now. "I'm here to confront the man who kicked me out of this school when I was 13, she said, her voice steady, but her words ringing with the power of the truth. "I'm here to make sure everyone knows what happened, because this man, your superior, has been hiding the truth for far too long." The officer who had been silent until now scoffed, taking a step toward Ava, her posture tense. "You're making accusations against a respected member of this community," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "You don't have proof of any of this. All I see is a disruption, and that's what we're here to handle." Ava's breath hitched, the anger bubbling up inside her once again. She had expected this, expected them to dismiss her, to try to silence her. The world had always been good at that, but not anymore. "I don't need to prove anything to you," she said, her voice thick with resolve. "I'm telling you what happened, and what you decide to do with that is on you. But you won't stop me. Not this time." The younger officer took another step closer, now inches from Ava, her gaze hardening. "You don't get to come in here and make demands. You're trespassing. You're causing a scene, and you need to leave." Ava clenched her fists at her sides, her body stiff with frustration. She had always known that no matter how loud she shouted, no matter how hard she fought, there would always be someone, some system, that tried to bury her story. But this time, she wasn't giving in. She couldn't. "You're just doing your job, right?" she said, her voice dripping with irony. "Well, I'm doing mine. I'm here to make sure the truth comes out. And you can't stop me from doing that." The silence between them stretched, thick with the weight of the words. But before anyone could respond, the door opened again, and a third officer stepped into the room. This one was different, older, his face weathered by years of experience. He scanned the room quickly, taking in the scene before his eyes landed on Ava. His gaze softened when he saw her standing there, resolute, not intimidated by the officers in front of her. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm, measured. The younger officer spoke first, her tone almost accusing. "This woman is causing a scene, Officer Daniels. She's making baseless accusations against the principal. We were just about to remove her when you arrived." Daniels raised a hand, cutting her off. "I understand, but I think we need to hear both sides before we jump to conclusions." His eyes turned to Carter, who had grown increasingly agitated, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Principal Carter, is this true? Are you accusing this woman of being disruptive?" Carter hesitated, his eyes flicking from Daniels to Ava, as though weighing his next words. Ava could see the conflict in his eyes now, the cracks in his armor that had grown wider since she had first stepped into this office. He knew he couldn't lie to this officer the same way he had lied to everyone else. He knew the truth was out there, and there was no running from it anymore. Carter's voice faltered, but then he straightened, as though trying to regain some shred of authority. "Yes, I asked her to leave, and she refused. She's making false accusations about me in the school." Daniels looked back at Ava, his eyes searching hers for the truth. "What's your side of the story, miss?" Ava took a breath, steadying herself before speaking. "I'm here to expose what Principal Carter did to me. When I was 13, he kicked me out of this school because I was pregnant. He made my life a living hell, and now he's trying to cover it up. I'm not leaving until he admits what he did, and I'm not afraid of anyone anymore." The room was deathly silent. The younger officers shifted uncomfortably, while Daniel's gaze never left Ava. For a long moment, no one spoke. Ava's heart hammered in her chest, but she didn't look away. She could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air, and she knew that she had done everything she could to make sure the truth wouldn't be buried again. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncertain, until it was broken by Daniel's voice, soft but unwavering. "I think we need to take a closer look at this situation," he said, his gaze never leaving Ava. "We can't ignore what's been happening here, whether it's convenient or not." Ava felt her pulse slow slightly, the weight of his words sinking in. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to give her hope that she hadn't come all this way for nothing. She stood straighter, pushing down the lingering knots of fear and uncertainty that had plagued her for years. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when everything would start to unravel. No longer just a girl caught in a system that had abandoned her, Ava felt the power of her truth coursing through her veins, steady and strong. She wasn't going anywhere. Daniels turned back toward the younger officer, his expression hardening. "We need to reassess how we handle situations like this. People don't come forward for no reason. If someone's trying to tell us something, especially something this serious, we need to listen." His eyes then flicked to Carter, who stood silently, his face flushed with both frustration and fear. "And we need to make sure accountability is maintained. No one is above the law, not here, not now." The younger officer, still visibly uncomfortable, nodded reluctantly, casting one final glance toward Carter. "But we can't just take her word for it, right? I mean, there's no proof." "No proof," Daniels interrupted sharply, raising his voice for the first time. "Sometimes the proof isn't in what we can see on paper. Sometimes it's in the courage it takes for someone like Ava to come forward. You need to understand that." Ava could feel the tension in the room shift. The younger officer's posture softened, the rigid expression on her face easing slightly as she absorbed Daniel's words. But Carter was another story. His face was pale now, eyes darting nervously between the officers, as if trying to find an escape route. His facade of control was slipping fast, and Ava could see the fear in him now. Fear of the power she wielded, fear of the consequences he might face. "Daniels, you can't be serious," Carter spoke, his voice tight and defensive. "I'm a respected principal. I built my career here. I've been good to this community." Daniels didn't flinch. "That doesn't excuse anything, Carter. Not if the accusations are true. And right now, we need to find out if they are. It's not about your career. It's about the truth, and it's about justice. We owe it to Ava, to everyone else, to find out exactly what happened." Carter's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Ava's gaze locked onto him, watching the man who had once held all the power over her, who had controlled her fate with a wave of his hand. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, but now she could see the cracks in his armor. The certainty in her heart was only growing stronger. The truth was no longer something she feared to speak. It was something that would be heard. And this time, there would be no ignoring it. As the officers began discussing the logistics of the investigation, Ava allowed herself a moment to reflect. She had faced this moment, this confrontation, with a resolve she hadn't even realized she was capable of until now. The old Ava would have been scared, would have crumbled under the weight of Carter's words or the police's dismissiveness. But she wasn't that girl anymore. She had spent too many years living in the shadows of other people's decisions. No more. She had stepped into the light, not for herself alone, but for all the voices that had been silenced before her. And now, as the officers' conversation swirled around her, Ava knew this was just the beginning of her fight. Daniels turned back to Ava, his gaze softer than before. "You're right," he said quietly. "You deserve justice, and we'll make sure you get it." Some strangers, she spoke not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, powerless. She spoke for those who had been turned away, silenced, or ignored because of the color of their skin, the status of their family, or the mistakes of their youth. She spoke for the countless generations of people who had fought, often quietly, to make the world better for those who came after them. "Justice is not a favor," Ava said, her voice steady, carrying with a strength she never knew she had. "It's a right, and no matter how many times they try to shut us down, we will keep fighting. We will keep speaking, because the truth cannot be buried. Not anymore. This fight isn't just mine, it's ours. And together we will make sure the world sees the change we deserve." The crowd erupted in applause, and Ava felt a swell of hope rise within her chest. This moment, this rallying cry, wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. She knew there would be more battles, more voices to amplify, more people to fight for. But Ava also knew that the fight for justice wasn't something anyone had to face alone. There were more of them now, more who stood for change, for equality, for dignity. And as long as she drew breath, Ava would continue the fight, not just for herself, but for every person whose voice had been silenced by the systems of oppression that still ran deep. The world wasn't perfect. There would always be injustice, always be people who tried to stifle the voices of the oppressed. But Ava knew that as long as there was breath in her body, she would never stop fighting. The battle against systemic racism and injustice wasn't just about dismantling broken systems. It was about creating a new world, one where everyone could stand tall and proud, their voices heard and their rights respected. And that was a fight worth everything. As the days turned into weeks and the investigation unfolded, Ava found herself constantly reflecting on the weight of what she had started. The small acts of resistance, the quiet defiance in speaking out, were now a tidal wave of change that swept through the community. What had begun as a personal battle for her own dignity was quickly becoming a larger reckoning for an entire system, one that had long turned a blind eye to the injustice suffered by those like her. The path ahead was still fraught with obstacles, and Ava knew that the fight for justice was never easy, never simple. There would be backlash. There would be moments when it seemed like progress was being undone with every step forward. But through it all, she had learned one vital lesson. The power of truth could never be silenced for long. Ava could feel the shift happening around her. People who had once whispered in the shadows, teachers, students, parents, were now speaking openly about their own experiences, about the systems of power that had shaped their lives and kept them in fear. They were joining her in the fight, each story a testament to the fact that the struggle against racism and systemic injustice wasn't a singular one. It was shared, collective, and bound together by the same desire for equality, for dignity, for recognition. As she watched the wheels of justice slowly start to turn, Ava felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. It wasn't just about holding Carter accountable anymore. It was about something much larger. It was about breaking down the walls that had allowed people like him to continue their abuse of power for so long. It was about creating a world where those who had been overlooked, dismissed, or oppressed could find their voices and speak out without fear of retaliation. It was about changing the narrative, not just for herself, but for all those who had come before her and all those who would come after. Ava knew the road to real change would take time. The system wasn't built to be easily dismantled, and it wasn't going to fall overnight. But for the first time in her life, She felt that change was not only possible, it was inevitable. It was in the conversations, the protests, the voices that had been amplified by the courage of one young woman who refused to stay silent. And so, as Ava stood before a crowd at a rally one evening, her voice ringing out to a sea of faces, some familiar, some strangers, she spoke not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, powerless. She spoke for those who had been turned away, silenced or ignored because of the color of their skin, the status of their family, or the mistakes of their youth. She spoke for the countless generations of people who had fought, often quietly, to make the world better for those who came after them. Justice is not a favor, Ava said, her voice steady, carrying with a strength she never knew she had. It's a right, and no matter how many times they try to shut us down, we will keep fighting. We will keep speaking, because the truth cannot be buried. Not anymore. This fight isn't just mine, it's ours. And together we will make sure the world sees the change we deserve. The crowd erupted in applause, and Ava felt a swell of hope rise within her chest. This moment, this rallying cry, wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. She knew there would be more battles, more voices to amplify, more people to fight for. But Ava also knew that the fight for justice wasn't something anyone had to face alone. There were more of them now, more who stood for change, for equality, for dignity. And as long as she drew breath, Ava would continue the fight, not just for herself, but for every person whose voice had been silenced by the systems of oppression that still ran deep. The world wasn't perfect. There would always be injustice, always be people who tried to stifle the voices of the oppressed. But Ava knew that as long as there was breath in her body, she would never stop fighting. The battle against systemic racism and injustice wasn't just about dismantling broken systems. It was about creating a new world, one where everyone could stand tall and proud, their voices heard and their rights respected. And that was a fight worth everything.